we see then that God sent a series of plagues in this process, in this interaction between Moses and Pharaoh. Now, the purpose of these plagues was not to punish Pharaoh and the Egyptian people. But the purpose of these plagues was so that Pharaoh and his people, and maybe even the Hebrew slaves, for them to acquire knowledge of the true God. To know the one true God means to recognize and then submit to his authority. You know, when Moses and Aaron had come to the children of Israel and said, do you want us to go to Pharaoh and see if we can get you set free? They were all in favor. They thought that was a great idea to try and be released from their bondage. But when Moses and Aaron went and talked with Pharaoh, not only did Pharaoh say no, but he also said, oh, they must have too much time on their hands. And so we're going to make the work harder for them. Used to be we provided the straw for them to make bricks. Now they have to go find their own straw, but they have to make the same number of bricks. Now, the Hebrew slaves, who were excited about the thought of Moses getting them turned loose, are now grumbling to Moses and said, Moses, you've done enough. Stop. You're making life harder for us. You're not making it easier. Sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes when we're moving forward with God's plan, in the process, there's a period at which life gets tougher. It doesn't always get easy. And that's what the children of Israel wanted. That's what the Hebrew slaves wanted, was for life to become easy, and they wanted it to happen quickly. But actually, it got more difficult. Well, 10 plagues were sent, again, not to punish, but to convince them that Yahweh, the God of Moses, was the one true God. The first plague was turning the water of the Nile to blood. The second plague was the plague of frogs. The land was overtaken with frogs coming out of the Nile, going into their homes, going into the palaces, being quite an irritation. But with the first two plagues, Pharaoh called on his magicians to do the same thing. They were able to turn water into blood. They were able to call forth the frogs out of the Nile. And so, as Pharaoh had his magicians do the same thing that Moses and Aaron had done on God's behalf, Pharaoh said, who is your God? I can do the same thing. My magicians can do the same thing. Then the third plague that was sent on the land was the plague of gnats. Now, some translations call it the plague of lice. Now, gnats sound pretty irritating to me, but lice sounds worse. And so, this was pretty nasty plague. And so Pharaoh said to his magicians, I want you to do the same thing. But they couldn't do it. They couldn't duplicate it. And when this third plague was sent and they couldn't duplicate it, Pharaoh's magicians said, it's recorded in Exodus 8:19, the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. Now, remember, the purpose of the plagues was not to punish or to chastise, but rather the purpose of the plagues was to acquire knowledge of the true God. And Pharaoh's magicians had gotten the message. They said, this is the finger of God. They recognized that who they were dealing with was someone that was beyond their power, beyond Pharaoh's power. And so they sat up and took notice. But Pharaoh was not at the point yet that he was convinced. He was not willing to trust in anything or anyone other than himself. Now, throughout this section of Exodus, on 20 occasions, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. 10 of the times it seems to indicate that Pharaoh's heart was hardened on his own, and 10 of the times it seems to indicate that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, some of the times we have problems with that idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart to accomplish God's purposes. But the thing is, even in hardening Pharaoh's heart, he never took away his will, his free will. Pharaoh was still able to make decisions for himself. He could have repented. He could have changed his mind. But as in the case of those with power, those at the top of the pecking order, all Pharaoh was interested in was figuring out how he could stay on top, how he could stay in control. The fourth plague was the plague of the flies, and then the plague of the pestilence upon the cattle. Now, the plague upon the cattle was a different type of plague. Back in the early 90s with the first Gulf War, we heard a lot about smart bombs. Smart bombs that could pinpoint a target, and even amongst a civilian population, they could target their who they were wanting to get very precisely with the smart bombs. Well, what God did was He sent a smart plague. That smart plague that was zeroing in on who He was trying to get a message to. And in the process, the cattle of the Egyptians died, while the cattle of the Hebrew slaves did not die. Now, in that process, I'm wondering if there weren't some Hebrew slaves at this point that were beginning to sit up and take notice. Maybe their opinion of Moses as God was beginning to change at this point. Recognizing that He was bringing hardship to the Egyptians, but He was sparing their cattle. Now remember, the purpose of the plagues was to acquire knowledge of the one true God. And even the Hebrew slaves, some of them were in a need of a change of mind, a change of thinking about Moses as God. The next plague was another smart plague, targeting only the Egyptians, and it was the plague of the boils. It affected the Egyptians, but not the Hebrew slaves. The seventh plague was the plague of hail, thunder, and lightning. Now, the unique thing about this plague was the fact that, as it was announced that this plague was going to be happening, people had an opportunity to bring their animals in, bring their slaves in out of the field and stay under a shelter. And those who took warning of this, the hail and the thunder and lightning that God was going to send, they came in for shelter, they were spared. However, those who didn't take God seriously, those who went about their daily work, sending their slaves to the field, sending their livestock out to graze, they were all killed in the process. So God gave them information, and they had to decide how they were going to respond. Were they going to believe what He said, or were they not going to believe what He said? Then the eighth plague was the plague of the locusts. And following both the eighth and the ninth plague, it's an issue that Pharaoh begged for mercy. He said, I've sinned. I'm repenting. Please stop the plague now. But then, after the pain stopped, he also changed his mind at that point. There are those people that we know, maybe even some of us sitting here, that in the face of a crisis have a come to Jesus moment, but then when the crisis passes, we go on just like living life like we always have. The ninth plague was the plague of darkness, and after that, Pharaoh said to Moses, I never want to see you again.